Hi, everybody. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for coming to our very first event of the Water Week. I'm so glad you're getting people rolling in. We're going to get started in about 10 more minutes. Please make yourself comfortable. We have tons of food in the back, so make sure you keep your full, and we'll have our panelists come up in about 5 minutes. So again, thank you so much, and we'll be more short. So you're fine. Where you getting at? Right. Oh, and keeping your seat. You have to go through the board picture. After trying for creative development, I have this to be on the sidewalk. Oh, the new one? All right. They come up and we brought our red washer. It's actually drop off line. All right, everyone. Again, thank you so much for being here. For those who may not be familiar with me, my name is just Katrina Smith. I am the executive director of the Water Collaborative in New Orleans. And I'm very, very happy to, so this is my first meeting on the Water Week. For a little background, I've been planning this since I started at the organization back in 2019, but in 2021, we tried to make it happen to the hurricane. I got left. Instead, actually. And so from there, I've been, tried to bring it back over and over, but it felt like the 20th anniversary of Katrina was the right year. NOLA Water Week, the theme is very diverse, which is it brings the healing power of breathing into the people. And it's all about creating new experiences and how do we move past Hurricane Katrina, not forget about it, but how do we build from that experience? How do we actually create something new from that? So at first event, we wanted to have media here to talk about the storytelling part of it. How do we tell different stories? What stories should we be able to think? And what stories should be, left behind right? Or some themes that you can. I'm going to hand it off to our amazing team member, Sam, who's not only moderating this panel, but I want to send a huge congrats and that name claps for her because she is going to do quite a bit of last summer, but she has also helped do every single thing that you see. So any physical piece of product, every event that it came, she has done it. So I want to send a big props to her. And then I also want to thank our fantastic sponsors. This would not be possible without them. So first of all, we are thanking Andrew where we are right now, we are able to donate this amazing space in kind. Thank you to the ACC. I also want to say thank you to our newest funder and sponsor, Liquid IV. So hydrate. And then they're not a presentation for this particular event, but I do want to send an amazing thank you to the Ruby Sipper for being a phenomenal partner for Watermelon Fest, which is going to be happening this coming Sunday. So we hope you all make it, bring your friends and your family. We have some fun games and activities and lots of more events planned. I also want to thank our event sponsors, Mississippi River Delta, who's in the room, and on him, thank you, Simone. Also Black and Environmental, Black and Marine Science, Tap the Earth, the Black Ocean Park, even though we have a lot, so we can't remember them all. So for politics, I know. But they're all different, because otherwise I can sit here for another 6 minutes and give you the full list. But I really want to thank all of our presenting sponsors. Last but certainly not least, we are in partnership with Tap as well, who's on this panel, but also live streaming. So if you have friends, colleagues, folks who are interested in watching us but couldn't be here because there's literally 5 million events playing every single day this week. We understand. It's being live streamed on the Katrina 20 Facebook page. So if you go to Facebook, you can share the link with your friends, share it with your colleagues, and they can watch it from there and hopefully we'll get some recordings toward the end. Without further ado, and thank you, food in the back, Russians this way, and I'll hand it off to our amazing facilitator. Hey, everyone. There we go. All right. Hey, guys. My name is Sam Cook. I'm the communications coordinator for the Water Collaborative. So I'll just be taking you through kind of what's in store today. So just look over. You guys hear me, right? Yeah. Okay. I'm going to protect. That's so today what we're going to do is we are going to kick off patient from get together achieving research. As we shoot the big application for about 15 minutes, we are going to follow that up with the panel. So get task panels, but I'll introduce in just a minute. After that, we'll move on to kind of a smaller. We'll give you some prompts and let you talk about some of the things that were discussed and maybe some things that come up for you and keep projectors moving around. After that, we'll come back to the group. We'll have the opportunity to discuss whatever we talk about for smaller groups together. So we'll get into our panelists today. First, we have André Smith, who you just met. She is the executive director of the Water Collaborative. Since taking on this role in 2019, she has been building the Water Collaborative to be a trend center in the sector, prioritizing innovation and agile planning. just what we use, but how we can frame disaster preparedness in a way that brings people together instead of dividing. Next slide. Let's start with where water sits in public opinion. For the past 2 decades, Dallas annual environmental issues all extracts people's desires about the environment, and water consistently comes out on top. Drinking water safety and pollution in rivers and lakes keep up other issues like air pollution, breathing climate change. And that makes sense. I think it's also it's a relationship with water is. It's in our rivers, it's in our bodies, it's in we're taking care of ourselves and our families. That closest to the shared memory with water is very powerful. And while water can be very good, we also know that it can be devastating. And so that impact, that reality is what makes water itself such a deeply human entry point for connection. And it gives us as communicators an opportunity to be people where they are. Next slide, please. But here's the tension. Just because water is a top environmental concern doesn't mean it's top of mind for voters. If you take a look at the screen, you see the results of the February Pew Research poll that asked people what the biggest national problems were. 72% said more money in politics, 67% said healthcare costs, 63% said inflation. By contrast, fewer than half natural disasters or climate change as top issues. So although there is strong majority support for participating in politicians are more likely to hear about the issues. And that gap between concern and urgency is why we need to strategic in how we frame water and disaster preparedness. Next slide. Let's talk about polarization. If you zoom in further, we see a big partisan divide around climate change. 67% of Democrats see it as a national, a major national problem. Compared to only 13% of Republicans. That's like 54-point gap. But when you ask listening people about the impact of natural disasters, that gap shrinks to about 20%. So disasters, whether they are floods or wildfires or hurricanes, they're tangible. People experience them directly. They see the damage from disasters in their neighborhoods, and that shared experience makes disaster preparedness a powerful entry point for bridging the lives forward life. It's much harder to argue about whether and whether climate change is separate from your camp. So that's when framing and communications around disaster preparedness is such a unified way to start conversations. It's something most people agree on. No, thanks. Politics about just recording when you came before. That's all, please. Well, I'm gonna do it. We also know that experience shapes our beliefs and our opinions. Research from the University of Chicago Energy Policy Institute and part of the Associated Press Center for Public Affairs Research found that people who lived through extreme weather in the past year, floods, hurricanes, wildfire, freeze, and drought, were more likely to consider climate change a real issue. More than half of people who experience climate events indirectly attributed that experience to influence their views. Those folks are willing to consider climate an important issue in an election and support actions like funding and climate adaptation. So in short, disasters shift public opinion. They really open more policy conversations that may have been harder. You could also hypothesize that as more people experience extreme weather events, the concern and support for policies like reducing emissions or funding adaptation will reduce. While a gap in opinion between those who experience extreme weather and those who don't may widen. Next slide. The 2025 in the past 5 years, 1 in 5 Americans reported experiencing water service impacts from extreme weather. Nearly half were required to leave impacts from drought, wildfire, reasons, or flood. And over 70% of the experience something for the family of the society. to reduce the likelihood of future water challenges. The impact on water from disaster is severe. People have lived in and as they do, they are thinking about government responsibility. 70% of people say that it is very or extremely important for the federal government to help reduce the likelihood of water challenges resulting from future natural disasters. But if you notice, this whole acts about weather and disasters, not climate. And so, just another reminder that the word climate can be used differently depending on who you're speaking to, which is why it's important to understand your audience and choose the language that you can use in the conversation. Next slide, please. Let's talk more about language. We hear the word resilience everywhere in disaster conversations. Our polling shows that most people feel positively about the word, and they're Spanish. 90% of folks don't know what the word means. And simple words like preparedness or protection actually perform better. When asked to define resilience, people are used. Some people think that means bouncing back. Other people think the word resilience means recovering strong. Fewer thinks that it means being strong enough to avoid crisis altogether. The takeaway is that resilience as a term might be useful in policy or professional settings, but with the public, words like preparedness, safety, and protection land a lot better. And in places like New Orleans, where people have been told to be resilient for decades, the word can feel like a burden, like you're just expected to endure and tough it out forever. So instead, we recommend describing specific solutions with clear language, stronger drainage, green shoots like soda, wetlands that buffer storms like people respond when they can picture how their community will actually be safer. Talking about safe neighborhoods, flood protection, stronger drainage, and pairing that with universal values like family, safety, health is a winning strategy. Next slide, please. The good news is that for the greatest results, it is very popular. We did include a series of questions in our polling. Report for disaster and we found it both unpopulated voters, although, as expected, Republicans and independents are less strongly supportive of climate resilience investments as opposed to disaster resilience investments. More than 70% of voters in cross-party lines say that it's extremely or very important to invest in disaster resilience. So the breakdown for them is 90% of Democrats, 78% of independents, and 81% of Republicans. So while people may differ on terminology, there's overall bipartisan support and broad agreement that communities need to be completed. So that shows us that climate preparedness is a safe and effective fight once we engage broader markets. Next slide, please. When we asked people what words they would use besides resilience, terms like community and together, that tracks with what we see on the ground during disasters. It's neighbors, churches, and community organizations that step up because of limited government capacity and support. But we do have to be careful about language after a disaster. We want to recognize and honor the importance of community-based organizations and mutual aid for disaster preparedness in the home. But we don't live in a way that lets the government off the hook for their very basic responsibility to keep people safe. Local heroes should be uplifted. The government can do the task to stay from the and if you're in the New Orleans meeting, or this league, here's a lot of belief. After Katrina, Nevada, other schools, people are praise for their resilience. But after decades of being called resilient, people are very fatigued by the word. In places like New Orleans and Ghana, where people are constantly living in the impact of disasters, they don't know if they're happy for survival. They want real investment in protection, safety, prevention so people don't have to keep through the tragedy. Most likely, finally, let's talk about equity. We asked voters which communities should be prioritized for funding. 3/4 said that communities at the highest risk of flooding or fire should be prioritized. 73% said communities with high levels of air and water pollution. 2/3 said disadvantaged communities. This was very good to know. Despite political attacks on programs like Justice Warrior, the public supports the principle of fairness. May not always use the same terms, but we believe that communities facing the greatest threats should come first. The most effective way to make the case is to talk about the risks directly. So families who are living with constant flooding, neighborhoods dealing with unsafe infrastructure, communities struggling with pollution. When you do that, equity isn't an abstract concept. It's concrete. It's related. And as data shows, widely supported. That slide, please. So to bring it all together, water is both deeply personal and widely shared. Disasters affect across global divides. They shape how people think about climate. They increase support for climate action. Preparedness is often equity resonates and language matters. If we celebrate the moment of local leaders, local government for their responsibilities, and frame preparedness with fear and human terms, we can shape a conversation that unites people who are in solutions. That's the story that the data tells us, and it's the story that I hope to influence. Thank you so much.
Thank you. That was really great. Thank you so much for sharing out all lessons that can be doing this today. We really appreciate it. I'm going to move into our panel discussion now, and all of the speakers have time again to give closing thoughts. So I'm going to start off. We're going to talk about the narratives that kind of pervaded the Katrina conversation. So the first question is, what narratives have dominated local and national coverage of New Orleans since Katrina, which feel outdated and which persist? And I am going to kick it off to Jessica. So.
Thanks, Sandra. Thanks, Sophia, for your presentation. I mean, it's funny, I was actually doing some writing about this very subject from quick to the panel. And I don't know if anybody's seen the current Brian Kugler documentary on National Geographic / Hulu. But I think one of the people I often get asked who who carries the biggest burden of the right response, as well as the pre and post disaster. And obviously there's a lot of burden on the government, there's a lot of burden on before, but we don't spend much time talking about the media. And how the media actually perpetuated the harm for not just days or weeks, but months and years. And I'll say this a bit too, really, and Katrina had the day before my birthday, so I'm 16 years old in Lafayette with my cousins and some family members. And suddenly we're out in the Lafayette area trying to buy groceries, buy food, and people are coming up to us saying that we're criminals. People physically came up to me and said, I don't know if we're comfortable with people from New Orleans in the space because you may be a criminal. Just because, and mind you, I had just lost everything that I know, right? My entire family, mother, father, grandmother, great grandmother, everyone lost everything. So everything I own, every big picture is gone, but suddenly when you look as a criminal and you turn on CNN, you turn on MSNBC or whatever channel at the time, this is 20 years ago, and the one thing they're showing is food. They're not showing people trying to survive, and they're also not talking about the reality of why Katrina happened in the first place. Not enough blame is being placed on the federal government, i.e. the president, FEMA, or Marine Corps engineers. I'll say how pervasive that is 3 years later, I was able to get a scholarship to go to NYU, Iowa State University. And, I had a mentor who I was assigned to do this exchange program for 6 months. My mentor, who was from, I believe, New Jersey or Connecticut, in the tri-state area, pulled me aside and said that, well, I don't really like people who wants because no one criminals. And you all are he had all, I'm not going to repeat things that was told me as a college student. This is might be someone who was walking in from the tri-state area, who took in the narratives that he may have seen on TV. And this is supposed to be my mentor, the person who was supposed to help me facilitate me around the university so I can meet different people. I never spoke to that person ever again, honestly. But it just shows how pervasive it is. And even 20 years later, I was in a conference in Baltimore last year, and someone said, "Is the world still underwater?" I said, "What?" I thought he was joking. I was like, this person has to be joking. He was that serious. Because people think, I mean, when you go out and travel, the one thing they think of the moment is contract, good food, and are you still underwater? We have to take back our narrative. And in order to build a better city, it's not just about looking back. Obviously, I can talk about all the stories and all the pain that is built up, but I think it's incredibly important to take back our narrative, not just as resilient. I'm glad you pointed that out to Kia, but thriving, tenacious, beautiful, culturally rich people who have been able to withstand government failures over and over, not just Katrina and Ida, but we can go all the way back to 1900 and talk about government failure and how we as a people have been exposing that America is not being complicit. There's a lot of stories in America that we're not complicit and instead using racist, classist tropes, and particularly media using those tropes to spin their message.
I'll take a pretty different spin on this, but I too have gotten them just last summer. Are y'all doing okay? And how's everybody anymore? Like seeing just those kinds of things. I obviously come at it from a coastal background, you know, rooted in restoration, where after Katrina, we saw how vulnerable the coast was and the great infrastructure and green infrastructure and those kinds of things. But to talk to that media narrative all these years later, I find it very difficult to be critical of things that are happening here or not happening here, not happening fast enough. Things that should have already been rebuilt or restored, you know, attention towards those kinds of things because you're worried about, they still think that you're underwater. They still think that things, you know, they have this idea that New Orleans is not doing well. So you struggle with trying to say, we're doing good. We are, you know, we've made some progress in restoration or levees and we've rebuilt this or that, but it's not enough. And so you have this struggle in your mind about, okay, what am I trying to convey here that we're doing okay, there's more to go. And it's hard. It's hard to figure out that line between saying that you're better, but you're still not good.
Yeah, I was just thinking about the conversation I had probably last week. I told somebody I was coming down and work for some guy that I very new. And you know, I mentioned the anniversary remit. You know, you guys made one of those comments that, you know, why everybody still, you know, living there. You know, like people just shouldn't be living there because of its ecology or geography or something like that. You know, mass simply thought that, you know, we could have the you know, the French should have unsettled this place 300 years ago or something like that, or not have everybody be kidnapped, you know, and slave labor. But you know, the fact is that people do live here, but it makes me think a lot about the narrative that because Louisiana is a coastal state that was built, you know, essentially with the power of the Mississippi River that has been dammed off. That it somehow this place is naturally sort of uninhabitable. And I was just talking to my colleague, Jamie, who lives down in Zulac, who was mentioning, you know, that while schools are closing and people are leaving, partially that does have to do with disaster, but they're not being physically swept away by the water. People are losing their ability to finance their homes or have insurance. You know, it's banks and insurance companies that displace people, not water, although water big piece of it. But anyway, as people are leaving, rich people are setting up hunting camps, down by you. Petrochemical companies still see huge value in South Louisiana. They're building some of the biggest, most expensive infrastructure ever been made in some of these liquid natural gas export facilities and huge plastic plants and things like that. So, on the one hand, some people are saying it seems to only apply to people, poor people, Black people, indigenous people in their homes. You talk about who shouldn't be living here or where it is bad to live in. So yeah, I still think that there's a lot of narratives hugely out there that this sort of thing is inevitable and people just shouldn't be living there in the first place, and maybe we should not be in the future. But I think what we need to be talking about is how we make choices about what we invest in is to make those choices. It could be that there's a whole different number of ways that we could be allocating resources in our society. We could have them sort of collectively. If we had a democracy, if we had an economy that was under democratic control, but we don't. So what we're left with is banks and insurance companies and people, up in the DC, Maryland, Virginia area that just don't think that people who live down there have a lot of
I think touched on what I was thinking in some way, but as somebody who's born and raised in Virginia, and saw Katrina from a distance, the narrative that comes to mind is that of fault, and how it was never the government's fault for not providing protection for its people. It was the fault of the people living there, or that it was the fault of Black communities in particular for not having resources they need to survive. Routinely, use turned into a blame game that never centralized the focus of that tragedy on repair or recovery. So I think we touched on that. And you just thinking, take that fault, the narrative, blaming the folks like being here.
Thanks, Katrina. Thanks, everyone. Yes, so my next question is actually, I'd love to touch on something that came up during the presentations. People, the fairness, right? The fairness of distribution of resources and how, people seem to across the board believe that areas that are most impacted by climate change or by disasters, right, should be receiving the most help and should be receiving the biggest. And my question for all of you, working in policy, where do you think that breakdown occurs, and why? And Kendall, I'm going to take it on to more for policy.
Grab the microphone anyway. Working in water policy, especially in the DC world, sometimes that you do hear this a lot. That water is a bipartisan issue. Everyone cares about it. Everyone wants clean water and stuff like that. I think the breakdown to me is quite clear. Is that especially in the sort of like free market economy that we mostly have, things that are profitable get attention, and things that are for public goods require more collective interaction. It's not. They're trying to make water profitable. I guess more and more utilities are being privatized. But for the most part, they thought about this as something that's sort of squarely within the public sphere. Something like 80% of our utilities are public. I don't think anyone necessarily thinks that the levy system should be done as sort of for-profit enterprise. These are things that you think of as squarely within the public domain, something that government should be done. And anything that government does requires money, requires taxation. And that is just an absolute red line for one of the parties and for a portion of the other party as well. So fact is, the stuff that we're talking about here requires a tremendous amount of resources. And to get those resources, you know, frankly, we're gonna have to spend a lot of money, a lot of public money, and it's gotta come from somewhere. And, I think everyone here knows that we have, especially in places like Louisiana, an overtaxed, poor population of it, so that money's gonna, where, from who has it, it's rich people and it's corporations, and that is just a red line that, you know, someone, will just step across. You remember from that, the city is influencing money in politics, but they usually hold it as well, so there may be ways of bringing in.
Yeah, I'm very, when I think about water, right, I just go for and part of that, if we're taking on water, because it's like, okay, what kind of water are we talking about? Are we talking about groundwater, drinking water, storm water, rising water, sinking land in the rising water? If it, all of that is still in very, very different. And I guess when I think about it, mostly Louisiana, especially New Orleans, is one of the only places to deal with all of those things wrapped up. Maybe you have to your experience in here or there, this issue. But really, New Orleans has to deal with all of that. And there's all these emerging water issues like, you know, the amount of water that's needed for the data centers, you know, you can talk about, you know, industrial facilities. That's new on the bingo card, if you will. You know, the amount of consumptive water that it will take to do that. So that's not an answer to the question, but it is just to talk about the complexity of places like New Orleans when you talk about water. I could very much appreciate the information too about the relationship with that. And how are these different there? Again, not an answer, but just a realization about why it was so deeply personal in a place like this. And how,
See the word. So I want to add, because I think we both make really valid points, but I think as soon as you started talking about Kendall, when you said it, my brain said the same thing, which is I went up to, there's a water meeting in DC where you go talk to legislators, and I'm not gonna name the legislator, but that legislator, I spoke when he was a senator, state of Louisiana, and it's like, oh, SRX are safe, water safe, no reason to worry. This is a bipartisan issue. This is not a particular issue that we're worried about. And then a few months later, under the big beautiful bill, they kind of SRX like close to 80%. And he voted yes. So one, I think there is a big conversation about how do we get our quote unquote elected officials, our Democratic representatives, to prioritize what we want to prioritize. Now, mind you, this is not just the price of water. This is a crisis amongst all public service issues at this moment. But water being the thing that, you know, keeps life going, it keeps businesses moving, that keeps access to communities flowing and running, should be top of the line issue alongside disaster preparedness and post-disaster. I think the other thing too is to Simone's point, I just want to add is that how complex it is. When I talk to residents in or even across the weekend, people don't know what to blame. Right. The first thing I talk to people about was if I even mention, I just flutter the word water, sewage water. That's like, well, we're not talking about sewage water, and then they check out. They're like, well, it's not about the water. And then you have another group of people who are deeply concerned with the federal government's oversight and responsibility, either in the port of New Orleans or the levee authority or Army Corps of Engineers, but they don't know again who to blame. I think there's a challenge in Louisiana, but I would also argue across the Gulf Coast for Texas and Florida, is that there is one small argument to be made that there's too many hands in the pot. Too many people regulating, too many people, this person has a problem, this person. And I say that as me and Simone are both on the CPRA advisory board, and people are like, who do they respond to? I'm like, no, I don't know. Right now, no. But, you know, we don't even talk about all the commissions, the water commission, there's two water commissions. I think there's way too many groups involved in the final decision making, almost every single person in this room will live. And as we all saw recently with the Public Service Commission, even though there was a huge outcry against that the incoming mega data center, it didn't matter. So I think there's a bigger conversation here is that one, there is complexity. There's, I think, over at least 12 different agencies in the Orleans Parish alone and have a canyon and a pot of water. But then on the other side of that, how do we make sure democratic representatives reflect the polling data that's here provided? That they're not they say they're prioritizing, but they're not actually doing that. And I think those are two things we're trying to do at once in a very complicated world.
Thank you, everyone. So my next question, I know that some of you out here may be media representatives, some of you may be storytellers, others may just be really interested in this topic. And welcome all of you. And sometimes what we find is that, you know, how do we get the meat of what we as organizers are doing out to the media? How do we let people know what's really happening? So just with that kind of thought in mind, I'd love to ask all of you what kind of solutions or policies are communities pushing right now that just aren't getting enough attention? And we can start Simone. We can start with Simone. That's a very good question. So I just want to just follow up on my name when Jessica just gave that answer. I was thinking about how the Army Corps of Engineers was responsible for giving the permit for what was going to be the single largest ecosystem restoration project, $3 billion to divert Mississippi River water. Yet they're also in charge of navigation. They're also in charge of the event when it's extreme low water and saltwater wedge moves up. They're also the ones in charge of when it's too much high water. They're going to open the Bonnie Ferry, and that is very complicated. But to have one person responsible for all of that and making very different decisions all along the way. Sam, your question was about like big questions right now in front of you. Is there anything that you're seeing that communities are pushing that just really isn't getting the attention it deserves at the moment? Yeah, I'm going to talk about something that's super fun, very glamorous, that's actually planning. And one very tough lesson after Hurricane Katrina and Rita is that we said here in Louisiana that restoration and protection cannot happen separately anymore. In fact, they had the incredible, difficult responsibility of essentially gutting two state agencies to create a new state agency and putting forth money and resources to get that agency stood up. But they also said, hey, we have to have a roadmap. We have to have a plan moving forward. And how can we do that, for a long time, right? And we can't just plan against the immediate aftermath. We have to think about it for the long term. And so they came up with a coastal master plan that had been updated every 5-6 years. It's always grounded in science. And even before that coastal master plan came to be the first one in 2007, that idea of reconnecting to the river was always part of the previous plans. I think Kendall said it earlier about we have this amazing resource with this river that has fresh water, that has sediment. It was integral to Louisiana's early success. And how do we find a way to harness that to be able to secure our future? But so we had at least 4 plans under our belt. It was grounded in science that the state, I think, did a better job each time. Sometimes little baby steps, but did better about trying to engage the community along the way. The last plan to be, they went to communities and said, hey, what are some solutions that you have here? Why don't you propose some of those? And that last plan came to fruition in 2023. See, you already falling asleep. It's not very interesting, right, Simone? It gets more interesting in the fact that people start to stray away from that. They start to put forth their own priorities. They don't make choices that are grounded in science. They don't go for that balance of short term and long term. You know, planning. They don't. They prioritize maybe just protection over restoration instead of protecting that protection. And so there's a real danger that we see politics starting to be injected back into that coastal planning process. We learned these really difficult lessons 20 years ago, and frankly, had seen some success since those 2 decades, since Hurricanes Katrina and Rita. But we're starting to see where there could be some real dynamic changes there. And we're starting to see maybe some of those lessons that have been forgotten or going back to, nope, this is good for me and my parish, and this is what I want to do. And so I think that, again, it is not attractive, it's not fun to talk about. This idea that we make really difficult changes and choices, and we prioritize things after those really difficult lessons, that we have to recommit to those lessons and moving forward. We have to recommit to the science, to having that community part of the plan, having them always at the table for those discussions. And so right now, as we'll see this turning this corner after these milestone anniversaries, excited, as I mentioned, it was also 15 years since Deepwater Horizon. There was a lot of things that happened this year, and so it feels like the right time as a reminder to get folks to recommit to those fundamental things that we said we would never do again, and saw success builds after we make these changes.
I want to piggyback off of what Simone said, just to say that I believe Governor Landry either tried or will try to circumvent the levy authority, right? Because when you're talking about planning should not be politicized. Either it's fact-based or it's not fact-based. It shouldn't be based on my personal preference of who gave me enough money this year for my re-election. It should be bottom line, it shouldn't be. And I know that when we're talking about Hurricane Katrina, the levy authorities, east and west, they don't exist, right? It was all 24 and there are many responsibilities. And if it had not been for levy authorities to maintain and manage these levies, I don't know if New Orleans is any safer because of someone's pet project. But I also want to uplift 2 or 3 other things. One, I think another I don't hear the media talking about is insurance. And the insurance prices that not only Louisiana is facing, but half the country, roughly 21 states dealing with insurance prices. So we're not just talking about the Gulf Coast, we're talking about Michigan, Iowa, of course, the West Coast and now Hawaii. So there's tons of states that are dealing with this. In fact, I opened up my social media page really briefly today. And one of the first things that I saw was an article about how the insurance market is not going to pay for the climate crisis. And if you look at the 21 Street that came out this year, it basically said that insurance companies were very clear. We are not paying for climate change. We are not paying for infrastructure that is the responsibility of the U.S. government. Our job is to protect the assets of our homeowners, which they don't break in the first place. So don't add additional burdens to that. I don't hear that we're talking about it enough. And when we're not talking about it, one, we feel disconnected. In Louisiana, we feel a burden. We think we're alone in this. But if you step out, if you have the time to read the report, they know that actually you're not alone, and that every single state, all 21 states and beyond should be getting together to figure out a solution. And it should be up to a few people, particularly men, to make these big decisions for the rest of the country. The other thing I want to add to that is, again, this idea of pre and post disaster. I don't have to tell you that FEMA is actively being dismantled. The National Guard is being pushed into DC instead of being here for potential events. We have to really remember that the partial reason, if you look at the history of Katrina, but also any other disaster, look what happened in Asheville. the lack of response from FEMA, the lack of preparedness from FEMA is astounding. And actually, I did a workshop last year with FEMA representatives and disaster preparedness folks from all over the country about, not even about 20 states. We were the only one that had an emergency management. I repeat, Louisiana was the only one that had an emergency management, particularly the ones. States that would sit here and blame us, you know, like the West, the East and West Coast, and say, well, why do you live here? None of them had emergency. And also the scenario that's in the media that says that, you know, there are disaster havens, right, or climate havens is a myth, and it's a dangerous myth, because the same cities, parishes, counties, whoever it is, who says I'm a climate haven, they will do nothing in preparation, and then by the time that event happens, it's too late. Lives have been lost. We've already seen flooding in New York. No one's talking about the lives that been lost in New York, Connecticut, and New Jersey just in the last month from flooding, because they don't think, literally people in New York don't think that they are dealing with climate change. They think this is only a Texas, Louisiana, Mississippi problem or a Florida problem. That's a dangerous narrative, and I feel like the media is actually perpetuating that problem, because every time I see an article, New York Times calling them out, they're always talking about climate change. I just saw an article literally this past week from Washington Post, top 10 climate change. That is incredibly dangerous and makes an assumption that no one needs to be prepared, and that
So then, exactly that, my thought is that there isn't enough climate preparedness and climate planning, outside of the goals. We at Harvard just do work with an organization based in Atlanta where communities, historical communities, and evidence are being flooded constantly because in downtown there's a gigantic swath of land that is an impermeable surface. So all of this water just collects in the middle of downtown and makes its way to these downstream communities that have been there forever, that of course are majority Black and people of color. And there is not seemingly like a crunch on the government to enact a plan for stormwater management. And so to build on your point, I do think that there is the narrative that only places near the water, places in the Gulf, places on the coast, need to plan for disaster preparedness. As you said, there are climate havens. We are dealing with increasingly dire straits when it comes to how the climate is impacting communities across the country. It's not just a Gulf issue; it's a Southern issue. It's something that's about right. And so to you, there doesn't seem to be any for folks who are not in this area to prepare for to create climate plans.
I think in some cases, we're always kind of looking for the new thing to talk about, and some cases that makes us forget, sometimes like who the real villains are. Like, you know, like, I think about data centers, which is something I read and talk a lot about. Definitely going to be a huge problem. It's going to increase our electricity demand by a lot, and otherwise it would be decreasing. But still, when it comes to water and energy usage, you know, still just relatively a fraction of the fossil fuel industry and everything that goes around that. Similarly, when we talk about mining for renewable energy is being a big problem, and it is something we should think about. But there's an incredible amount of mining that goes into creating fossil fuels, and to sort of tie back into water, the biggest polluters of water, the biggest users of water, the biggest emitters, are still all contained sort of like within the fossil fuel and petrochemical industry. Usage of water, also agriculture, which is hugely reliant on fossil fuels as well. And so I think about there's this statistic that I just think about all the time, especially when anyone is trying to turn off the faucet and stuff, which I think it's good not to waste water, but, every person in the country using, water accounts for just 8%, the US Geological Service has a census of water, that can go into that. That over 90% still being used by the heavy industry and agriculture. So in a lot of ways, I think that, we always are writing new stories. And I think even Canadian groups are interested in imposing new things, but really still is one of the power of the fossil fuel industry, I think, that is driving a lot of this. And I think they've kind of gotten off the hook in terms of, again, sort of talk about AI and data centers. There's really, they had a conference in Pittsburgh, I think earlier this summer, with representatives from the Trump administration, right? Like, this is like one of the big, the fossil fuel industry is always looking for them to sort of like pivot away, because renewable energy really is sort of, on the rise, especially, in other countries. But here, the fossil fuel industry is always looking at, plastics, fertilizers, and now sort of like data centers, right? That even if we're not using them anymore, to power our homes or to power our cars, which still always going to be need for stuff. And without that, there's no climate change. Like, we can build all of the renewable energy that we want to power everything, but if we don't stop burning fossil fuels, the climate crisis is never going to get better. It's just going to get worse. And just real quick to sort of tie something in there too, is that I think I see a lot of stories that look at really sort of like within a sort of like U.S. lens that makes climate action really hard and untenable and reliant on future technology. And other countries in the world are just building unbelievable amounts of wind and solar. Like, in a lot of ways, it's really sort of like a U.S. Problem when it comes to this intransigence with building new forms of energy. And again, I think that goes back to the power of the fossil fuel industry. And so I think sometimes these old, familiar villains, even though sometimes it seems boring just to sort of just keep talking about, to keep saying this over the same story over and over. It's like, you cannot lose track of it.
Okay, there we go. Great. We've got 2 more questions for you guys. I'm going to take a little bit of a pivot here from what we just to kind of build on some of the things that you all have been talking about. I know, with especially the anniversary of Hurricane Katrina coming down to Kendall, I think earlier you mentioned, people saying, well, people shouldn't be living there anyway, right?
I know.
No, not you. Kendall did not say that. But people say that to you, right? And so I think something that we all need to be talking about is climate migration, right? And what that means to be a climate migrant, what climate displacement means. So if I could kind of just pivot to that for all of you, how should we be talking about climate displacement going forward? And anyone's eager to start, or just I can start with you.
I'm laughing. Well, there's a lot of porn happening right now on climate migration. This is why I think actually, and so it's a very important conversation. I will say, and I'm going to be really brief because I don't know, we've touched on a lot of it. Climate migration does not look one way. I think there's an assumption from people, globally, that climate migration is, I am a climate migrant, someone's saying that a lot. I've been working with the Climate Migration Network for the last 3 years, and all of the studies show that most people who move from a town today, at this moment, we're now talking about 20 years ago, the last 5 years, are climate migrants. They're not moving. Most people aren't moving because they love X, Y, Z city, unless it's for a family reason. Most people are moving because it's too expensive, and the cost is rising because of climate change. But people aren't seeing that alignment. Or they're moving because of insurance, or maybe their home or areas need to be flood zone or fire zone, they can't move back. And so now we have to move again. And the third thing is that towns are shrinking, and that's something that New Orleans is dealing with right now. Pre-Katrina, New Orleans was roughly over 500,000 people, and today we are barely keeping pace at 350,000. And every single person that you ask why they're moving is because I hear insurance, I hear the cost of living is too expensive, the stress of living here, right? Knowing that a hurricane or a natural disaster, and not just that, the inefficiency of government to respond to these things, right? And also the politicization of these things, right? You need your government to care for you, you need your government to be present, you need your government to acknowledge the frustration, the pain, and the trauma, and instead of saying, I don't want to pay for X, Y, Z because of tax, whatever, or these people have special interests. So anybody you know in this moment that has moved, and it hasn't been because my family is moving because of X, Y, Z, is probably a climate problem. They're just not calling themselves that. And again, to Kia's data, what is climate anyway? No one knows what that means on a day-to-day scale. They know what they see and what they feel. They know their wallets, they know their pocketbooks, they know what their children experience. I know people whose moved who said my kid had been to too many events and it was disrupting their schooling. You are like a migrant, your children just like migrants. People who never moved back to work are time at migrants, partially. They're also like government disaster failure migrants, but I don't think that's the word for that. But I think that whatever the case, we have to really delve deep into understanding that kind of migration is nuanced, it is a rainbow of issues, and we need to come up with a better word. Me as a kid talk about words, sounds all the time. People don't like the word resilience. They really don't like the word climate. What word can we use to better describe I'm moving because of the experiences that I'm having, which are all likely tied to work gas.
I'll jump in right here to add to your word salad, but managed retreat is the word that people don't like because they're not managing that really well, to be honest. Right? But I'll just add, so, I started working at this organization called Restore or Retreat. It was 20 years ago and had been around for just a few years before that. And it definitely started out as almost like a threat, right? We'll take care of this and then we're going to be forced to leave. And then, of course, we did see people leave. They did leave. And obviously, and where I came from and home from the Viking region, people left for a lot of different reasons. And they did move to be closer to their grandkids in Thibodeau or in Baton Rouge, those kinds of things. But they were leaving nonetheless. And those were people who were making choices to leave, but they had been used to leave. They could leave, they could make that decision. Their greatest asset wasn't tied up in the backyard and, had to go tripping, a couple once a year. Their bill is, worth more than their house, and it's their business, it's their retirement fund, it's their, the inheritance that they will pass down to their children. So you can't just say, hey, I'm just going to live in Baton Rouge, you can still shrink, so a lot of the decisions that were made by people who were making those individual choices were by folks who could make those decisions. And then kind of circling back to that unfun, unsexy planning process. When you start to take away huge options like reconnecting to the river that will create a sustainable or more sustainable future, and start moving away from these large scale regional projects that are really the size and scale that they are because they match the challenges that we face here, they match the huge problems that we have. When you start to move away from those things, you really need to be having more honest conversations with communities about their risk of living there, their individual risk, their risk as a community. And I think that is something that we are going to be confronted with very soon. That where do folks go? We saw communities that like Baton Rouge, and we were talking about this just the other day about where everybody's trying to forgot how bad they travel and how, people would go and work at on their homes on the weekend and it would be nothing to take almost 3 hours to get from New Orleans to Baton Rouge during those times after Katrina, right? But what about those communities that they're going to And they need to this, not just infrastructure wise, but whole communities and whole cultures, relocating entirely different set of questions and challenges that they face in the future.
Yeah, thank you so much for this question. Thanks again for hosting and everyone who's been here, especially I think that's in the large collaborative. And yes, Captain Earth is hosting a two-day event called the Modern Forum that Nicola Jackson is focused on climate migration, and we're coming out to report on climate migration. That will be on our website at taproot.org, should be. And yeah, I mean, you all pretty much already nailed everything, you know, that is, I'm sure the need of the report is that this is not, most people think of it as an international phenomenon, and it is, but people don't tend not to think about it on a domestic scale. When we talk, Taproot talks a lot about, right, it's called the Modern Forum, by the way, because the modern forms migrate and insect. And we also know that people that traditionally sometimes follow migratory patterns as well. And so we tend to think about migration. It all sort of depends on the experience of the individual who's sort of going through whether or not it's by choice or not, whether there are welcoming communities or not, whether people have resources to do it or not, whether or not this is, you know, something that can be a more part of like which is right to remain. So then if you're being disinvested because your community is poor or from Black Indigenous, you don't have the right to remain where you are. We talk about the right to migrate. And so we have all of these orders, I think, for all the waterheads, you know. Louisiana is perfectly good infrastructure built. It was not because people really had an agenda that they wanted to privatize the degree here so that rich people could start making more money. That they could get rid of people they didn't want to live here anymore, which was mostly poor folks and black folks. So those are sort of the I guess sort of three ways to sort of think about immigration. I guess I don't really. I guess the thing that I would add, especially someone who lives further north, is that although think about climate migration as being an issue that only places like Louisiana have to think about. You know? And so, you know, housing, for instance, takes a long time to build, to get the money. It's also, like we talked about, it's not immediately profitable to build housing if you don't have climate migrants in the population, right? Like, so essentially, if you want to be a welcoming community, or maybe whether you want to or not, you're going to be just based on the people on the move. You have to start building housing to get there. There's a bunch of people arrive, then all of a sudden there's pressure on the property markets. Prices go up, and then you're scrambling, and you have maybe a resentful sort of the population. So we need to have the younger quote unquote safe, as somebody, has just mentioned, there's probably nowhere that is absolutely safe in time of crisis, but places that will be welcoming communities need to start building housing now. And if it's not going to be profitable, it's going to then come back to some of the social enterprises that we talked about probably being led by the government. So, yeah, I think that welcoming communities is another big part of the kind of migration we're looking at.
Statement very brief, because it's not an answer, but it is the affirmation that we should be telling more stories about climate migration. Storytelling is a very powerful tool. It allows people to see themselves in the circumstances and experiences of another. And so, as Jessica mentioned, there are many climate migrants who do not know that that is their experience. And so I definitely think that we should be telling stories about climate migration so that more people are aware of what's happening to them, and so that more people can share their own stories about climate migration.
So thanks for that, Sophia. And for time's sake, we're gonna start to wrap it up, but I just want to give our panelists an opportunity to offer any closing remarks. I know that the topic of today really was water and climate, but also it was about challenging the resilience narrative. So I'll let you all offer closing remarks if you'd like, and maybe in those remarks you can touch upon that word, what we kind of do with the word resilience.
I'll be brief because I don't want to hear from y'all. But I will say that one really quick thing is that we're not using the less of the word nutrition effectively. Everything that we've been seeing in the last several years, whether it be an actual the Guadalupe River incident in Texas, Hawaii, there are so many lessons in Katrina, whether it be about how to respond to certain events in the moment, how to make sure you save people, how do you save lives in the moment, and then how do you build afterwards. I don't think people are using Katrina as a lesson, but instead using it as you mentioned, as a way of explaining. Particularly when we start thinking about racist and classist narratives around poverty, around African-American experiences, using that as a tool to blame based on what has, I think, been declared as at this point not fault, but that's not what people believe. So I wish there were more through lines when to say, hey, this happened in New Orleans, and it's also still happening 20 years later in all of these other places. But also, not enough is being told about how even though every single aspect of Louisiana, and particularly New Orleans, like has been a back. I'm glad you brought up the housing, right? I was a youth organizer around at that time, and I tried to make my way over to the city council to join that housing discussion, and the doors were closed. And from there, when those doors were closed, the city council unanimously voted to tear down all of the housing with no regard for how to rebuild them back. We have had the onslaught of the involved charter school system. Every single aspect of our daily lives is a product of Hurricane Katrina. And instead of people using it as a warning tool to say, hey, don't let these systems privatize everything from your public transit to your education system, the media's on silent. These should be stories that should be uplifted and are not. And I would let in on the word resilience is problematic because people don't know what it means, but also it puts entirely the blame on people who have already become victims of whatever failed system there is. There are other words we can do, but I do a whole presentation sometimes on this concept of reassessing resilience and how do we get away from that word, because it actually is ineffective for the person who's experiencing the harm, but also ineffective for government. It's ineffective for both parties because one removes blame and actual responsibility, and then residents will internalize that by doing all the work. I know mutual aid is a big thing, but mutual aid is a product of this concept of resilience, and that we have to do the work of government should. Instead of us marching down the FEMA doors, the EPA doors, or the Army Corps doors, we're doing all the work, and then we experience burnout, and then 10 years later, people leave anyway. that's not effective. And so we have to move away from not just the word, but also the concept of living around this word.
Yeah, I think I have a final word to say. We oftentimes ask, hey, what can I do? God, we are talking about these things, seem so big, they seem, what can one person do? And I think the easiest thing that we can do is tell people to use your voice. We have seen it time and time again, whether you are storytelling or whether or not you have an idea or you see a problem, you just vote, so you ask to use your voice to vote. You have got to, and that's the one thing that, when we talk about building $3 billion projects, what can I do about that? But it takes all of those voices together, and we have seen that. We don't want people to forget those lessons. We don't want them to think that they're just powerless in the decisions that are being made. And so, whether or not you are so nations like the water collaborative or tackling the so just keep continuing to try to use your voice.
I guess what I would say is that I was sort of thinking about when I flew in here in the airplane, the big new shiny airport, and flew over the levee system, which is actually quite impressive, from a human sort of engineering perspective, and drove here on downtown on the interstate highway system, which is for the most part around the country very well maintained and just continually updated over and over again. Is that we have the tools that we need to be able to survive as a species and probably even to thrive. It's just that we're not prioritizing, in my opinion, the right things right now. And so I think that a lot of times we look at the climate crisis, we look at issues around water, and a lot of times we feel really hopeless, I think, for good reason. But I think even given the scale of all the problems, these are all solvable things. It's just a matter of one, supporting each other on a human level, for sure. I feel like I'm always sort of coming and talking about policy and government and machines and things like that. So I don't want to distract that. But that we can move people around. We can build new forms of renewable energy. We can keep each other safe. We can do all of this. It's going to take a massive shift in political power, I think, to be able to accomplish that. And a lot of it, starts here with us and the people in this room and building plus topic.
Thank you all for being voting and sitting here and how we can run the summit. But when I think about the word resilient, it strikes me how passive of a word it is. It strikes me that it's kind of a sentence that, oh, you survived the crisis, and so that's all that we should worry about. And so I really appreciate you here today, being able to share data on why we should move past that word, and why we should forward into words that prepare us, words that actually consider all of us and all of our wellness in pursuit of stable and safe, healthy communities and neighborhoods. So thank you all for your attendance. Thank you for inviting me.
Thanks, Kia. So I'm just going to ask everyone to do a big round of applause to all of our panelists. And we all come up for today and for sharing your insights and expertise with us. We really, really appreciate it. The next portion that we're going to move into, we'll do just kind of a short group discussion time. So if you're sitting in the pews, you can turn around and chat with each other. If you're at the seat, you're Q&A first. Okay, we'll do it first. Okay, let's take it all back. We're going to do Q&A first. So before we move into those smaller group discussions, does anybody have any questions for any of our wonderful panelists? This is kind of going back to the conversation of a strategic plan. So I think something that we all know is for funding and stuff. So how do we go into these communities now and sell the concept of making a plan? With what money, with what funding source, how do we tell them that this is a plan that's just gonna sit on the shelf afterwards? So yeah, someone was gonna, I had someone down. Yes, I felt that, I knew you were coming. That's a very good question. And, so after Katrina and we didn't have this large scale planning after, and I'm just again, kind of speaking up this program was mainly on the best year. It would be very lucky if we had $100 million, right? In investments, and it's kind of a weird word to use, but that's really what it is, because we were trying to reduce risk, but we just said, you know what? We can't do this again. We have got to have better understanding of what we are all doing. We have to think bigger, because again, those solutions have to match the size and scale of the problem. I think we've got a great colleague of mine, Dr. Alicia Rainford, calls it random acts of restoration. What are we doing? Why are what does that little marsh have to do with anything? So to put all of that together. And the first plan came together in 2007, just kind of taking from all the other different plans. And in 2010, we see Deepwater Horizon. So already that plan was ready for Louisiana to be able to say, listen, we have some ideas, it's rooted in science. We kind of put these things together here, large scale. So essentially, we were able to put we put our money where our mouth is, I guess, right? We had this way that we would spend this money, but then came the argument, Louisiana has a really terrible reputation of how we spend our money and we waste it, or those kind of things. And so, are we sticking to that plan? Are we still using the priorities in that plan to make our coastal investments? And for 2 decades or a little less than that, we were seeing that. We use that as a roadmap. We use that to be able to say, we gave me some money, I put it in, I invested in it, and this is how I reduce risk. And I have some more. and so that was able for us to continue to make the case. And when some of these climate grants started coming out, we had this roadmap. And then because of the decades of success, we had this ability to prove that we were having some kind of return on investments. And so, again, it's not fun and it's not great to think about, but this idea that we were just all, supporting this plan. We do our own polling, which is something that's a little unusual, but we try to make sure that we keep the temperature of what we're doing still correct. And at the last polling we did, 92% of Louisianians believe in a science-based plan, which I can't, for Louisianians to believe in a science-based plan, and not many, right? We have a national pollster that does our polling. It's like, you don't see numbers like that anymore. Like 92% of people don't like their grandma. Like, it's just unbelievable that Louisiana really rallied around that. That included, 2 decades of education. There's still more needed, et cetera. But this idea that we can have this is how we were making these investments, so that when we did go ask for more, it was there. It also gave us this, it's 50 years, $50 billion. And in a lot of ways, they just kind of pick some of those numbers to be long-term, to be what's achievable. But now I think that there is a real expectation that Louisiana could and should invest $1 billion annually in this coastal program. That doesn't even include the Corps of Engineers portfolio. Doesn't even include that. And so when you start to kind of go down that rabbit hole, how many jobs is that? What kind of youth workforce for generations could we have in this water sector? And so all of these things began to spin off of this plan, but it remains deeply rooted in the fact that it is science-based, it is always evolving, and every day we're getting better and better about trying to talk to communities about the challenges that they face, but also these opportunities. And that is what we can't see as a reversal all these years after Hurricane Katrina.
Yeah, I think that's really well said, especially I think, the idea about, having a good idea shelf, because, sometimes, a lot of things sort of can happen sort of unexpected politically. Disasters being one of those things that we talk about, well, sometimes there's, more money, more will to actually do something. So yeah, and then, I would say that there's always other, unexpected things happening in terms of, or maybe not unexpected, maybe things that actually, take action, like the coastal parish lawsuits against, oil and gas would a great way potentially, to have money, getting ready to the industrial tax exemption program, would be a great way to find money. These are things that don't involve necessarily asking, the average being a citizen to sort of be able to pop up money to be able to, to fund their own survival. This is, there are big pots of money, in Louisiana that are there.
Did you have any, is there something you want to question?
Kendall, you mentioned that, alternative, we're not going to turn it to the fuel sources. Could we ever build enough alternative fuel sources like solar and, wind to replace the amount of water that fossil fuels consume? If they're doing 90% consumption and we're only doing 80%, could we possibly build enough solar and wind to make a dent in that?
From what I'm reading, and because, and I wish to live in Berkeley, so we can sort of renewable energy, but I'm going to do my best to channel what I've heard, which is that we lose an incredible amount of heat just through like inefficiency through fossil fuels, like having lots of little explosions, put your hand on the hood of your current combustion engine car after driving. It's really, really hot, because there's just heat, sort of blowing off that. And the same time true of, with like electric cars. So there's a lot of, I guess that is also, but I think what you're getting at is that we have to talk about like demand reduction in some ways too, and especially I think in the industrial sector. When we were on the climate emissions task force, I think one of the people who's modeling energy demand, they tried to electrify all the petrochemical plants. You would have to cover the entire state with solar panels and still get it on. That said, there's also why it's really important to invest in transmission lines too, because there are places of the country that have less of an energy demand and can produce more energy when it comes to solar. Like, we move electricity around the way that we move water pipes with gas through pipelines. So I do think that talking about what are the things that we actually need? Do we need huge plants building single-use plastics? Do we need AI data centers for metas of whatever it is that AI does? I think that there are a lot of questions that we can ask ourselves about how much energy. There's also ways to do that don't involve necessarily less consumption than people think about it. So it's insulating every home would put a lot of people to work. People would use less energy and they would also just be more comfortable in their homes. So I don't think that we should necessarily think about replacing every bit of fossil fuel energy with renewable energy. I think we should also think about how we can build a better public transportation system. I can't take a train to back here. Why don't we have more public transportation takes around? Everyone has to have, we don't want everyone. I don't want to do electric F-150, that has, 10 times as much battery as a smaller car. So I think there are a lot of decisions I guess that's one of the themes that we've been talking about, is that I think they were really just sort of, miss out on resources, and I think fossil fuels is a previous example of that, but I don't think that renewable energy is the silver bullet, or we don't have to think about, what we do, is who's using it.
Just gonna add really quick, most people don't realize this, but in oil and gas, the biggest emitter of carbon and also the biggest electricity user is sewage and water. They take up about 60% of roughly the grid. And when myself and Logan participated in their strategic planning process on trying to take, how do we get other energy sources? We asked them to look into solar, we asked them to look into, wind, we asked them to look into everything. And then, contractors told us, like, at the very end, well, we just went with gas. And I was like, okay, did you even look into it? Not really. And so it really shows, to Kendall's point, there are things that we can do that are really simple. Sewage and water board, by the way, what they're using those emitters on is the pumping system. These people don't realize there are 24 pumps that are pumping 24/7, 365, all day long, to keep the water level artificially low. Within that, Logan and she would have a pretty graph here with presented in my times that the biggest emitters of carbon and most of the emitters of electricity are petrochemicals, not even the industry. So I think there is enough, if we were to all solar or all wind, there is enough energy, but the people who are trying to make money, right, there's a whole conversation about, we're going to do that. But there's a bigger conversation here about why does every industry need to make money? And then the basic industry that needs to be making money, they put it in the mainland system that we're not asking for. And what I see in these conversations around AI is no one asks for AI. Did anybody in here like beg them to make an AI? You went tweeting to Meta or AI? No one did. And we're being forced to use it now too, right? You don't have an option, right? You turn on Google, you ask Google a question, the AI from, you got to go to Google and you turn up a setting and it's a whole process to not use them. So, but it's against our profitability for certain plants, right? We're trying to diversify their portfolios, and that's really the issue, and it's pulling away from the managed responsibility and holding up this.
Hello, thank y'all so much for being great panelists. Thank you, Jessica, and the Water Collaborative for putting this whole week of events together. I'm very excited to see what the rest of the week looks like. My question is also related to the fossil fuel industry. As a New Orleans native, we know, and me and Jessica, we joked about this when we met, like New Orleans natives, we seem like we're a dying breed nowadays in our own cities. Not getting to that, but as a New Orleans native, I have a good friends who families work for fossil fuel plants, and that's just been what they always did. The employment, their dad do it, and now they do it. So can y'all just talk a little bit about how we should go about having conversations with people when it comes to feeling like anti it? Like, I definitely don't want my close friends to be working in plants just for their own health and safety, not even mentioning what these plants do for the rest of the world. At the same time, I don't want to tell them where they should work and how they have to make their own like money to live. So can you tell us how we should go about these conversations?
Yeah, I mean, I think that everyone who's lived down here has had, those conversations where it's actually, one of the order started out, sort of organization, when they go for this sort of policy. When you start talking about big out fossil fuels because of the deepwater horizon and because of Hurricane Katrina and loss and the climate crisis, it does come back to fossil fuels. And yet, I bet, I mean, because who knows somebody that has a family friend that works in the fossil fuel industry? Yes, every single thing goes up. Of course, that's why sort of the just transition framework that is now so popular from nationally is growing organically down here in the first place. So that because people here do care about what happens to their neighbors and all of this, but I think all of the things, a lot of the things we talked about in the room today do involve a lot of work. So I think there are going to be jobs created through this massive sort of undertaking of transitioning our entire economy, which is based on fossil fuels. So I don't think that there's any shortage. But that's not necessarily that satisfying to talk to, because maybe you have somebody who's 50, 60 years old, who's not yet retired, who's thinking, well, else we and I think that for me, that this is oftentimes a really good way to start to edit and say, well, you know, why is it that losing a job is such a you know, sort of matter like that. We have unemployment insurance. Why isn't it big enough to cover people? I was aligned with for a number of years here where people are just trying to work all the time, whether it has to do with profitability of the restaurant or because it's summer and they slow down. People get like, this is just the nature of this country all the time, is that people are fired sort of mercilessly whenever they're not profitable for their company and just suddenly occur. And we don't have you know, a bit of a social safety net for them. And so I do think that we want to talk about just transition programs and potentially specific for workers in the oil and gas industry, but you know, even more than the hands that are going to go through the oil and gas industry, it's like, who's going to, if you know somebody who's like lost their job, you know, every hand is going to go up as well. And so I think as we're talking about rebuilding our entire society around energy, we also ought to be talking about engineering our entire society around how we work for each other, how we do that in a systemic way. And I think that pivoting from oil and gas to talking about all workers is great.
Like, I'm coming back, but I just want to kind of very briefly that what's the key is preservation, something that I would need on. So when people are just interested in climate work, I said, let's start talking about water instead. What's coming out of the faucet? Because if you start talking about what comes out of the faucet, because that's your direct, you have children, maybe you have concerns, maybe your health, so someone in your home has health challenges. You start talking about further PFAS, or you start talking about other types of contaminants and pollutants that come from, you know, plastic pollution to petrochemicals, and you're drinking and consuming that water, and you realize, oh, well, we can so without repercussion, and the EPA has to have these really high action levels that are pretty much achievable to actually really have repercussions for your actions, and I still have to drink that water and then pay for it. Those are the ways that should start to pull. The same thing with disasters is, again, moving it away from the individual people or the communities that have been affected and saying, well, this disaster, and I saw that happen more recently, especially with the fires on the West Coast, of people saying, hey, the fires in these communities are not because of anything that the individual has done. It is about the sole responsibility lies with the gas. And so I just think that changing the narrative is really important. And I think to your, we can probably go on about this, I know I could. It is really important to center, can't really lean on this, center people in community. Because when people hear issues of climate change, they hear issues of any of these topics, it feels distant, it feels far away, and it feels like we're not talking about me or talking about us, but to personalize it. And that starts with conversation, that starts with having sometimes hard conversations, but it also starts with having, being open to hearing different narratives. Because I think also us in this world, we tend to live in a bubble. And maybe someone, I've worked with people who are conservative and they're like, I believe this. And then you really start to say, okay, I hear your concerns. But do you realize that this is why this is happening? Most people don't know. And so giving them that opportunity to express their concern and then start to actually start to pull them in is the first place to start. Instead of throwing like 6 pounds back and then changing them for now.
Do we have any questions here? So, New Orleans has money, right? That makes us completely different than everywhere else in the country. I mean, I have never seen a group of people after a hurricane like I'm from London, and I've been there about 5 years ago. You never seen people come together without cell phones, without power, without anything except for a guy on a bicycle on the block. You know, it's such a profound way as it did after I. And I guess my question to you guys is, with the capacity for organization that New Orleans already has, they're always producing, sub-producing, you know, the elaborate systems of pockets of people that we have. What would you have them do as activists if you could snap their fingers and organize them all together?
With an audience, I said, I got an answer. I'm happy. I think that is a more thing I'd love the other one makes to chime in because I'm a bad movie gardener. Okay, I'm a bad, I know shame on me, I gotta go hide in the shelves when, maybe because I go to theater, I go to like two parades and one, I write my mouth. But I think what I hear people already doing, I think there are folks that are already doing this work, that have started to do that along, like I know in the lanes and trying to work on recycle that, and there's like eating companies that are coming out. I hear crews moving in that direction. Like everything in society, the people in charge of the crews, they're older and not as versed in subject matters. And so you find that the crews that are younger, walking crews that are rooted in like more community, they're like already there. Your historical crews are going to take a long time because they are rooted in tradition, and that doesn't mean that tradition is bad. It just means that tradition takes a much longer time to swing it. I think also, again, the infrastructure is there, and I think the cities, and so I'm going to speak on Lawrence, speaking about the Office of Resilience and Sustainability has been doing a lot of work to try to pull the crews in. I think also, and I'll say this in closing, I'm not going to anybody else, and I know someone who care about it. A credible observer. I will say that the tourism industry faces, right, the people who move the money at the top, where all the tax dollars go, about 90% goes back to like New Orleans and Company and all these other people, the state, the lieutenant governor's office. A lot of that lasts because it's their job to change America. Wherever they swing, the crews will eventually swing, if not sooner. I have participated in a couple of strategic planning meetings with the ones and company over the past 2 years, so I know they're talking about it. Now, when that report is going to be released, I don't know. But I in a conversations I've had with the ones and company as well as some people in the lieutenant governor's offices, we're losing business for a lot of reasons. Obviously, the narrative that we're talking about resilience, but also just really not feeling resilient to other people. But also, there's a big narrative that New Orleans is not, or Louisiana is not progressive enough. I don't want to bring my conference here. I'm afraid for the safety of the women. I'm afraid for the safety of, migrants that are coming here for particular events and that they're not doing enough. But also, just it looks bad. People who I know who visit the migrant this year are like, my God, I could throw that much plastic out of the ground. Thousands and thousands, hundreds of thousands of pounds of plastic just go into a landfill somewhere. And they don't go to sewer or to see just beans in our water system just hanging down off the pumping system. I mean, it's really pervasive. So it requires people at the top to change the tradition that's over 100 years old.
But more than happy to say that she said fossil fuels CEOs that hey, but talking about Mardi Gras is a little too political for me, so I'm not really like that. But what I heard in the question too is that there's I think sometimes people are saying they're just sort of like disorganized in some way, but what you're getting at is that there are huge pockets of organization in pretty much every neighborhood all over the city. Instead of how could this, we tend as climate people, I think sometimes that we're trying to sort of like, reinvent sort of like the organization to new structures that like around climate. And so I think maybe sort of like what you're getting at here is that there's already this type of organization, how can we be politicized? And that's a really good question, a really good idea. And I think that even just beyond Mardi Gras, that's the way we all need to sort of be thinking. I'm already a part of an organization, or I'm part of a running club, I'm part of whatever. I don't think of this inside of politics, but maybe I should.
How long is Billy Nuggets been in Canada? I'm just pointing. Oh, it's not tournament. Oh, that's great. So I'm just pointing out that when you're talking about moving and crews and Mardi Gras, you have the person who's really in charge of the fun job from the governor, he has to change, or the position has to change. And so if we're gonna get the city and all these crews, and I would probably want to build, like, as a big part of the problem.
So guys, we're getting up against time. We are gonna skip the group discussions. I think this has been a really wonderful group discussion, honestly, with the size of people. We have made time for one more Q&A. There's somebody with a burning question. No? Okay, well then, what, did I miss somebody? Okay, great. So then what I would leave you all to think about, this is one of our questions that we were going to ask you guys to talk about, but just think to leave and reflect on is what stories do you want to be telling about New Orleans in 5 years? And I say 5 instead of 10 or 15 because we should be thinking about these things now. And we can change the narrative in 5 years. It doesn't have to be 10 or 15. So I'll leave you all with that. I want to say thank you so much again to our panelists. Thank you for your presentation. No, we need the full availability on one of these websites. Is your report already available? It is. Okay, great. So what I'll do is I'll send out a link with the report to the water hub report as if you have today. So if you didn't sign up on Eventbrite, make sure that you scan the QR code at the front as you leave that says did register, no problem. So that way you have your email and we can send you a link to that report. Rebecca, if you're able to go back one slide. This is what we've got going on for the rest of the week. Some exciting, if you're a teacher, we've got a really exciting event tomorrow. Climate activists to come together with educators and talk about bridging the gap between climate and education. On Wednesday, we've got a very exciting film screening of a film called Upstream Downriver. Jessica is featured in that. And then on Thursday, we've got a lunch and learn, which will be conducted by our policy team. We'll be talking about the 2025 legislative session. It's called, did they actually pass that? And that is the question we'll be asking. And you can see, I won't go into all of them, but we've got some really great events. You can either grab a program from the front, or if you're able to up here, scan the QR code. You can register. All events are free. And I will let Jessica finish it off with some closing words.
Yeah, and 2 more things. The lunch and learn is going to be as a passive. So if you want to go, you see the guys to do it today, because we're probably going to be on today. And then I also just want to uplift the Waterville Festival. It'll be the first annual Ruby Slipper on Broad Street from 4 to 8 in the evening, little soiree, you get some watermelon, you play some watermelon games at a tournament. We have some DJ tunes. It's going to be really fun. So I just wanted to uplift that as well for friends and family. Again, I want to say thank you to Sophia. She flew in from North Carolina. Thank you for Virginia. That's wonderful. And Simone, also a sponsor and partner. Thank you, Simone, and also Kendall Tapper has been a phenomenal partner. So thank you all. And again, I want to thank you, Kailloux, for providing the space and time, and our main sponsors again, that we're having some secrets all of our event sponsors throughout the week. Thank you all for taking the time off of a busy day. I know this is a crazy week and there's a lot going on, but thank you for giving us a little bit of time and have a wonderful afternoon.
Yeah.